estate license exams for dummies. Part 3 is All Minds, Owning and Transferring Real Estate. Chapter 8, Knowing the Limitations of Real Estate Ownership. In this chapter, finding out about different private limitations, understanding government regulations that limit property use, checking out land use regulations. Chapter 8, Knowing the Limitations on Real Estate Ownership. Real estate ownership conveys many automatic rights, such as the right to sell it, or build on it. But these rights usually aren't unlimited. Your right to use a piece of real estate that you own often is limited by or subject to physical, financial, or legal rights of others, including other people or governments. Sometimes limitations simply prevent you from doing something specific with your property, such as building a commercial building in a residential area because of government restrictions on land use. A private, as opposed to a government, limitations may give you the right to another person, usually the person who sold you the property, to determine the style of house you can build. This chapter provides information about private and government limitations that are likely to be on the real estate licensing exam. I specifically discuss topics such as voluntary and involuntary liens, regulations, concerns, new construction, and much more. Carrying a not so heavy encumbrance, private limitations on property use. An encumbrance is a right or interest in a place of real estate that belongs to someone other than the property owner. Because someone else holds an interest in the property, the right is limited or restrictions on its use of property. An encumbrance generally are considered private limitations. However, the government can make a claim on your property for unclaimed taxes, which also is considered an encumbrance. Encumbrances come in two flavors. No, not chocolate and vanilla. Financial claims against the real estate, these claims are called liens. Limitation on the use of the land. Included are easements, encroachments, and restrictions. You can sample them in the sections that follow. Looking at liens. Real estate liens are financial claims against someone's property. Depending on its purpose, a lien exists with certain characteristics. How and why it permit someone to place a lien on your property has to do with the type of lien to which you're subjected. I talk about all that in the following sections. Abracadabra, creating and removing liens. When you borrow or owe money, your real estate frequently becomes the security, called collateral, for that loan or debt. Collateral is an item of value you pledge in return for securing a loan. Okay, so far, even though you actually borrowed the money, the lien attached itself to the property like a leech. Thus the real beauty of a lien, not to you, of course, but to the person to whom you owe the money. It is to stay with the property, regardless of who owns it, until the debt is paid. Although you may think that attachments is unfair, it helps guarantee payment of the debt. With the lien is attached to real estate, it can limit ownership in a couple of ways. It can mean the property can be sold against your will to pay off the debt, such as the non-payment of the mortgage or taxes. Showing up when you sell your property because the new owners doesn't want to pay your debts you had to pay, and you owe to clear the debt and remove the liens before the property sale can be finalized. If you don't have the money to pay the debts when you sell the property, the debts then is paid from what you get from the sale. Removing a lien really is just that simple, unless you can prove the lien was a mistake. Who gets paid first? Priority of liens. One characteristic of liens, the one that exam writers like to ask about, is called priority of liens. A more appropriate term is priority of payments because it refers to who gets paid first when property is sold against the owner's wishes to satisfy a number of different debts. It also is referred to as a portion of the person being paid, such as a mortgage is in the first position after taxes. The first person paid from a court-ordered sale of a piece of real estate is the government. Real estate taxes take first position in the payment of a lien, and several liens are attached to the property, and one is for unpaid real estate taxes. Real estate taxes are paid first, including any special assessments or special taxes above and beyond the general real estate tax. Payment of general and special assessment taxes take priority over all other liens, regardless of when the liens were attached. For more on tax liens, see one size doesn't fit all type of liens later in this chapter, and in chapter 16. Sometimes, because of too many liens, a property may not be able to be transferred or sold, primarily because not enough money can be gained from the proceeds to pay off the debt. Once in a while, some of the lien holders will take less money just so the property can sell. Quite often, it is the second mortgage holder in a foreclosure sale who has to settle for less. Other than real estate liens, all other liens usually are paid off in the order in which they were recorded in the appropriate local office and public records. The county clerk's office or some other office of public records, particular states where you reside, may have some variations on the general rule, but in most cases the first paid rule applies. If the real estate is sold to pay off one or more liens and the money it is left over after all the liens are satisfied, the property owner receives the remaining money. It's all in the name. Liens distinguishing traits. All liens have two specific traits. They're either voluntary or involuntary, and they are specific or general. Here's what I mean. Voluntary or involuntary. You either agree to have the liens put on your property or you put the heir against your will. A voluntary lien is where the property owner willingly takes some action to enable the placement of a lien against the property. The mortgage is the most common example of a voluntary lien. An involuntary lien is placed on the property against the owner's will. If the property owner owes money to someone, such as a tax collector, and the owner doesn't pay, a lien is placed on the property. Because this type of lien was placed on the property without the owner's agreement, it is considered involuntary lien. Specific in general. One other characteristic of a lien is identifying how many separate pieces of real estate it can be attached to. A specific lien attached to only one property. A general lien attaches to a number of properties. If you own 3 properties and have a specific lien on one of them, no one can force you to sell either of the 2 properties to pay off the lien. On the other hand, if someone places a general lien on the 3 properties you own, the lien applies to all 3 real estates that you own. In other words, all 3 properties are encumbered by the general lien. Some general liens also can be placed against your personal property. For instance, income tax liens are general and can show up when you try to sell your yacht. One size doesn't fit all. Types of liens. You may wonder what type of lien can be put on real estate. In this section, I point out what actions prompt someone to place a lien on a piece of real estate and some of their characteristics. Pay particular attention to whether the liens are general, specific, and voluntary or involuntary. For some reason, state test writers love asking at least a few questions about these 4 types of liens. Tax liens. A tax lien is placed on real estate for unpaid real estate taxes. Remember, the government organization or agency placing the lien is paid first if a property is sold. Different levels of government, from cities, towns, and countries, can place tax liens on property. School districts and water and sewer agencies can also place liens on properties. Tax liens are involuntary and specific. Mortgage lien. A mortgage lien is a voluntary, specific lien. In fact, it's most commonly type of voluntary real estate lien. When you borrow money to buy or refinance a piece of real estate, you give the lender a lien against the property. Some states call this a deed in trust lien. Mortgage lenders are careful about wanting to be paid the money they loaned you. They usually make sure that no other lien takes priority over their liens in that they have what is called a first mortgage lien. Any other liens are called junior liens. If a mortgage lien is in first position, the only other lien that can take precedence over its payment is a tax lien. Mechanic lien. A mechanic lien is a lien placed on the property for non-payment for work you had done on the property. For example, you didn't pay the plumber, so he puts a mechanic lien on your property. The mechanic lien is involuntary and specific. Your state may allow brokers to place liens on real estate for unpaid commissions. This practice varies by state and may vary by whether the commission was earned from the sale of property or a lease negotiation. You may also be able to put a lien on the property for an unpaid commission if the listing contract or the purchase agreement contains a clause that enables you to do so. So check it out. Instead of a lien, your state may permit brokers to place a list pending on the property. A list pending isn't a lien, but instead is a notice of a potential lawsuit which could result in a lien. It's recorded in the public records to give notice to future buyers of real estate. Some states permit brokers to place disputed commissions funds in the escrow account while the disagreement is resolved. This is not a lien. Judgment lien. Judgment liens, sometimes called judgments or monetary judgments, usually are created as a result of court action. Say someone sues you for a personal injury claim, for example, and the courts find in favor of the person who sued you. If you can't pay immediately, the court may place a judgment lien against your property. Judgment liens are involuntary in general. They're certainly involuntary because you didn't voluntarily put your real estate as a security the way you do for a mortgage. A judgment lien is general because it affects all the real estate. However, it usually applies only to property located in the county where the judgment is listed. Nevertheless, a judgment lien can be filed in other counties where you own property. In addition to real estate, judgment liens also can be attached to personal property, such as your car, boat, unique furniture. Judgment liens, however, may vary from state to state, so you may want to check out whether laws in your state. When a property is sold for non-payment of mortgage debt, tax liens are paid first from the proceeds, usually followed by mortgage liens, and then other liens, mechanical and judgment liens, for example, in the order in which they are placed on the property being sold. Easing into easements. An easement is the right of another person or entity to use someone else's property for his or her benefit. The other person or entity can be an adjacent property owner, or another party, such as a utility company. The easement can include the right to use the specific space beneath the ground, on the ground, or up to the air above the property. The person or property receiving the benefit is called the dominant tenement, or dominant estate. The property on which an easement was granted is called the servant tenant, or the servant estate. Don't worry so much about the words estate and tenement. The important words to remember are dominant and servant. Think about the words serve and dominate. The property being used or serving the demands of the easement is a servant. The property that benefits from the easement or dominates over all other is dominant. You're probably thinking, why would you, as a property owner, actually let someone use your property for his or her benefit? Or for that matter, why would someone else let you use his property for your benefit? But the fact of the matter is that many times two people voluntarily create easements. On the other hand, easements also can be created in a couple of non-so-voluntary ways. Categories of easements are pretty simple and often are part of the exam. You'll see information about gross and apparent easements, which involves the person who benefits from the easement. I'll also give you some information about how an easement can be created against your will. Running with an apparent easement. Easements are defined by who benefits from them, and a Puritan easement benefits a neighboring property. By the way, don't get confused. If your home state reverses these words and calls it an easement a Puritan, it's the same thing. Your property can be landlocked, which means that it has no direct access to a public road. So, to access your property from the public road, you must cross someone else's property. If the other property owner gives you a permanent right to drive or walk across his property so that you can have access to yours, he's giving you an easement, a Puritan. Although the property owner you're negotiating an easement for uses the benefit, the easement will continue after you and your neighbors sell the property to the other owners. So it is your property that actually benefits from the easement. Under the statute of fraud laws, which exist in some fashion in every state, easements must be in writing to be valid. Because an easement, a Puritan, attaches itself to a piece of property, it is said to run with the land, which means that whatever the property dominant estate that benefits from the easement is sold, the new owner has the right to use the easement that its old owner had. Just in case I've lost you here, let's put it in terms, for example, that the previous paragraph where you were given an easement to cross someone else's property. When you sell your property, the buyer obtains the same rights that you had to cross the neighbor's property. Several easements covered in this test include the surface easement, which is to build a driveway to get from the public road to your house. An underground easement, for example, to bring water lines from the city's main access to your property to your neighbors. An overhead or aerial easement, to run electrical lines to your house by crossing your neighbor's property. So gross. Easements and gross. Another type of easement is called easement and gross. This type is easement benefits another person rather than a piece of property. A gas company has a gas main running parallel to the street in front of your house and wants to connect it to another line in the street behind your backyard's neighbor's house. The gas company needs an easement and gross from you and your backyard neighbor to install the connected lines with your respective properties. Typical easements and gross that you see on exam are utility easements. For example, the city wants to connect two sewer lines by crossing your property with an underground pipe, or the electric company wants to connect a line between two poles. In need. Easements by necessity. A court order creates an easement by necessity to permit someone to gain access to your property. For example, say property owner A sells buyer B a back portion of land but neglects to give buyer B an easement for access. If A then refuses to give B an easement, B can go to court and get it by court order, an easement of Puritans. Easements by necessity doesn't necessarily mean that you can buy a piece of property without any access and expect the courts to order a neighboring property owner to give you an easement under all circumstances. Usually a seller refuses to provide an easement is the circumstance under which the court gives you the easement. The doctor didn't give you this. Easements by prescription. An easement by prescription is an easement that is created by the actions of one person against the interests of another person. Every night, when your neighbor Joe comes home, he drives his car across a corner of your property. The reason doesn't matter. He simply does it. You see him do it, but never stop him. And he does it for a long time. Eventually, you get tired of him driving across your property and tell him to stop. But he says, no way, I've got an easement by prescription. Joe takes the matter to court, and the court agrees with him. Joe now has a permanent easement by prescription across your property. An easement by prescription is related to an adverse possession, which is discussed in I Thought I Owned It, Encroachments and Adverse Possession section later in this chapter. The principal difference is the prescription easement gives you the right to use the property. Adverse possession gives you ownership of the property. Like adverse possession, easements by prescription is not automatic. It requires a court order as a result of a lawsuit. When looking at Joe's case for the details of how an easement by prescription is created, the fact that Joe's actions had persisted for a long period of time came into play. So how long is long enough? That length of time varies according to which state you're in. 10 years is the typical minimum time, but it can be longer or shorter. You saw Joe across the property. He uses his open, and a lawyer can call notorious, meaning it wasn't hidden. In a sense, by not telling Joe to stop sooner, you gave him silent permission to use the property. Joe crossed the property every night, so his use was continuous during the period prescribed by state law without interruption. This scenario brings up another issue. Suppose in your state the period of time requires for a prescriptive easement to be created in 10 years. Joe sells his property after 5 years, and the new owner picks up right where Joe left off, continuing to use the property in plain view of another 5 years. Do you think he'll be able to claim prescriptive easement? Much to your annoyance, the answer is yes, because it's simply called tackling. Tacking is a factor that allows for addition of the time during which several different owners continue engagement in the same use. So if 5 different successful owners use the property for a prescribed period of time, for example, your state 10 years requirement, the latest owner's request for an easement can be granted by the court. Share and share alike. Party walls. In an area of the country where houses and other buildings are built side by side with no space in between the outside wall, they're shared by 2 buildings is called a party wall. Each building owner owns half of the wall and an easement for the other half. Fences on the property line and a shared driveway works the same way. Agreements that deal with maintenance issues usually in place for shared items like these. These party walls easements are created at the time the buildings are built and sold. They are parented easements because there benefits the adjacent property owner. It was fun while it lasted, ending easements. Now that you let Joe and others walk all over you, so to speak, just how do you go about getting out of an easement? Easement can be determined in several ways, including an agreement to release. The person who possesses the easement, a dominant tenement, agrees to give up or release a person across whose property the easement exists. Servant tenements from the obligation. By merge. Merge is a fancy word for joining of the 2 properties involved. For instance, A has an easement to cross B's property. B buys A's property. The easement disappears. An abandonment. Use it or lose it. Say you had a driveway easement for some county property that you visited regularly, and for one reason or another you stop going to the property. Eventually the easement may be considered abandoned and you can lose it. The need no longer exists. The need for an easement may no longer exist. Perhaps, for example, a new road being constructed that allows direct access to the property. Terminating an easement is not automatic. Usually some form of court action is needed to terminate an easement, unless the 2 parties agree, in which case some form of legal document agreeing to the termination of the easement needs to be executed and recorded. It won't work. It won't let you drive, but it's still a license. A license is a temporary right to do something on someone else's property. A license usually is permission that's given for one-time specific use. Depending on the state laws, the agreement can be either written or oral because it conveys no interest in the property, but only a short-term permission to use it. Say, for example, the neighbor is building a house and the construction vehicles need to have access to his property. However, until he installs his own driveway, the easiest way for them to get to his property is to cross your driveway. You give the neighbor a license to use your driveway for the purpose, but you retain the right to cancel the license at any time. This arrangement does not give your neighbor any permanent rights to your property. No, you can't paint your house purple. Deed restrictions. A deed restriction is a limitation on the use of your property that appears in the deed to your property and is put there by another person. In fact, it specifically calls a private land use restriction, distinguishing it from the public land use restriction that I talk about later in this chapter. A deed restriction is considered a private agreement because no one forces you to buy the particular property governed by it. And if you do buy it, you voluntarily agree to the abidance by the restrictions. Deed restrictions are also referred to as covenants, conditions, restrictions. CCRs is something restrictive covenants. You're probably already asking yourself how someone can agree to a deed restriction and why. I'll answer these questions next and give you some other important information about how deed restrictions work. For more on deeds in general, head to chapter 9. Providing help for those horses. Deed restrictions can be placed on a property for any number of reasons. A farm owner once subdivided into a farm into lots and sold off to individuals to build houses. Interested in horses, the farmers wanted to promote horsemanship in the area, so before selling any of the properties, he put a set of restrictive covenants on all the lots. First, because the old farm featured horse trails, the farmer restricted that no one lot owner could block any of the existing trails. Even though driveways on the various lots were quite long, the farmer restricted them from being paved because pavement is bad for the horse feet. Okay, I know their hooves. And finally, because the zoning permits smaller lots than the original size of each lot, he restricted any further subdivision of the lot so that to attract people who would want larger lots for their horses. What is it I can do? A deed restriction limits what you can do with your property. For instance, a deed restriction may limit you to build a house on only a certain architectural style, or not allow you to build a house of less than a certain size. Deed restrictions can limit almost anything you want to do with your property. The only limit on a restriction is that it can't be something illegal. For example, a restriction that says you can't sell the property to a member of a particular ethnic or religious group is illegal and therefore invalid because it violates fair housing laws. Deed restrictions bind not only the first person who buys the property after the restriction is put into effect, but also all future owners, unless the restriction has a time limit. Sometimes a deed restriction in public law covers the same issues, but have different degrees of limitation. In that case, the more restrictive or limiting the two apply, local zoning, which is discussed in You're in the Zone, Understanding Zoning Ordinances, sections later in this chapter, will require a minimum of 1 acre for each house you want to build. But say that the actual size of the property you're buying is 3 acres. The developer in a subdivision has put a deed restriction in place that says individual properties may not be subdivided against. Even though the government, through the zoning ordinance, says you ought to be able to get 3 separate pieces of property out of the 3 acres parcel, the deed restriction won't permit it. A deed restriction wins because it's more limiting. Although not always the case, deed restrictions are often more limiting than local laws because they may be designed to do what local laws normally do not. For example, restriction the color you want to paint your house. Who says I can't do it? Anyone can put a deed restriction on his property that binds all future owners. Typically through deed restrictions are placed on a group of individual properties that have been created as a result of a subdivision. The restrictions are placed in the deed by a person creating a subdivision as each property is sold. Subdivisions are discussed in the many from one subdivisions section later in this chapter. The term restrictive covenants is used to mean a set of restrictions that apply to an entire subdivision, which is a large piece of real estate that's been divided into smaller properties to be built on and sold individually. Restrictive covenants cover all of the properties in a subdivision and may become part of a municipal subdivision itself. Every property owner has the right to seek enforcement of the deed restrictions through the courts. So if you want to paint your house purple when the restrictive covenant prohibits using that color, any of your neighbors can seek an injunction to force you to paint your house in other unrestricted color. However, if the neighbors ignore your new paint job for a certain length of time, then they may lose the right to take you to court. The law of the state in which the property is located governs the time frame after which you can lose the right to seek enforcement of a deed restriction. The loss of rights that result from not using is called laches. I thought I owned it. Encroachments and adverse possessions. The ultimate limitation on the use of your real estate is losing the use of it, or in some cases actually losing ownership of it. Loss of use or ownership doesn't happen automatically. It requires a court decision. Crossing into neutral zones. Encroachment. An encroachment is the unauthorized or illegal use of someone's property by another person. On one hand, the encroachment sometimes happens by mistake, and that's the case of someone building a garden shed a few feet over the property boundaries lines onto your property. On the other hand, it can also be intentional. Someone, for example, may build a house on your country's property. Yes, that really happens. As is usually the case, an unauthorized use and claim against someone's property ownership or use of it lost as a result of court action. In a case involving a disagreement over the boundary lines, court actions may be necessary to resolve the dispute. Tell that to those feuders, especially when one of them claims they have automatic rights to the tomato garden because they've been using it for 10 years. Staking and claim. Adverse possession. Adverse possession is someone actually claiming ownership of your real estate because of how they're using it. Say your neighbor puts up a fence 10 feet into your property. It was a mistake. He knows it, and you know it, but neither of you does anything about it. Not a big deal, you say. He'll just have more lawn to mow and less no problems, right? Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. If the fence stays and your neighbor uses the 10 feet of property as though it's his own property, his own for a required period of time set by the state, he can go to court and claim ownership of the property by adverse possession, and he may even win. For more details about adverse possession and other ways of losing ownership of property, check out Chapter 10. One point to note about adverse possession: if you're thinking about building a pool on a county property behind the house, government land is usually protected from individual claiming ownership or the use of adverse use of government-owned land. Land use regulations, a major public limitation. A state power to limit the use of a property is based on something called police power. You may think that the police power is unusual way traffic tickets, and you'll be particularly right. The police power that every state possesses in general power to pass laws for the health, safety, and welfare of its citizens of the state. Although each state government may keep some of the power to regulate land use for itself, most of it is passed down to local governments like towns, cities, and counties. As a result, the police power is passed down by the state through enabling laws. on enabling legislation that it adopts. Police power is pretty broad, and most of it has nothing to do with real estate. In this section, I talk about the part of police power that limits the use of real estate. The drawing board, making master plans. Most municipalities, villages, towns, and cities create what is called master plans or comprehensive plans. These are written documents, usually including many maps, that are a compilation of studies of current physical layouts and municipalities, projections of how their government wants their municipalities to look in the future, and a description of what needs to be done to accomplish these projections. A municipality conducts a number of studies in competing its master plan. An partial list of these studies include capital facilities. Municipalities take inventory and analyzes public-owned buildings and parks. Demographic, population characteristics of the municipality, such as the age and level of education, are studied. These studies rely heavily on census data gathered by the federal government, which divides the entire country into census tracts, from which it gathers population statistics as part of a federal census every 10 years. Housing. The municipalities examine the current and future housing inventory and needs. This study includes public and private owned housing. Infrastructure. Infrastructure refers to roads, sewers, water lines, and other physical facilities that are important to the growth of a municipality. These studies look at current facilities and the need for new construction and improvements of these sort of facilities. Land use. Area of land within the municipalities are examined, usually on a map with respect to their primary use, such as housing, shopping, office, industrial, and agriculture. Based on these studies, as usually with citizens' input, the municipality set goals for its future and development plans to achieve these goals. One of the primary ways by which a municipality implements its master plan is through the adoption of zoning ordinances. You're in a zone, understanding zoning ordinances. A zoning ordinance, which in some municipalities is called a zoning code, is a set of rules that control what property in a municipality can be used for. It regulates where the land in any buildings will be located, the maximum height of the buildings, and the amount of land it can cover. The zoning code essentially tells you what you can build, where you can build it, and how much you can build, all by designing zoning districts and establishing specific regulations for each district. Zoning districts. In an area that designated for a certain type of use, housing, shopping, so on, typically a zoning ordinance divides a community into different districts for residential use, commercial use, agricultural use, industrial use. Several districts may be designated in each of these categories. For example, one residential district may permit high-rise apartment buildings, while another may allow only single-family houses. But I really want to build a skyscraper. Variances in zoning. Most zoning ordinances organize unusual circumstances that require a certain degree of flexibility in applying zoning regulations. A one property variation from the requirement of the zoning ordinance is called a variance. Variances can be granted whenever an owner can prove that a particular difficulty or hardship will result from the attempt to build on the land, or to show the existing zoning will divide or deprive them or her from all economic use of the land. For example, a zoning ordinance requiring that the building must be set back 50 feet from the front property boundary lines, but because the rock outcropping and extends deep into the land from the back of the lot, the 50 feet setback would be impractical. A variance may be granted, permitting the building to be built 10 feet from the front boundary line rather than require 50 feet. This type of variance is called the area variance. A use variance, on the other hand, permits a different use of the land. One example of use variance is where the owner of a single family house in the area zoned for single family houses receives permission to convert it into a home with 2 apartment units. A state-specific item for you to look into is what board or agency grants variances in your state. Names like board and zoning appeal, planning and zoning boards, and zoning hearing boards are common. But to be sure to check it out, remember that a board on one locale may be a commission in another. You'll probably get this information from a local building or planning department. On one condition, several permit use. Another type of variation from the requirements of the zoning ordinance for the individual piece of property. In some places it's called a special permit use. In other places it's called conditional use permit. And in some places it's called special use variance. In any event, these variations are for use listed in the zoning ordinance that are different enough from the permitted use within the zoning district that they require special review by municipal agency. A nursery school in a residential neighborhood is an example of a use that may be appropriate in a residential zoning district, but is different enough to make an additional review a good idea. The municipality may want to require the nursery school be observe specific hours of operation or install special safety features using issue a special use permit. These permits generally are issued to the property owner and either run for a length of ownership or a specified period of time with the ability to renew them. I was here first. Non-conforming issues. A non-conforming use refers to an established structure or the use of a piece of real estate that wouldn't otherwise be permitted under current zoning. Non-conforming uses generally are buildings and uses that exist neither when no zoning ordinances was in effect at all or when an old zoning ordinance was in effect that allowed such building to be used. Perhaps your grandfather built a factory on the edge of town at a time many years ago when the area had no zoning ordinances. The factory continues to operate, but in the meantime, the town grew and a zoning ordinance was adopted that zoning the area around the factory for single family houses. Speaking to your grandfather, it was not unusual for this type of non-conforming use to be referred to as grandfathered use. Although the specific regulations dealing with non-conforming uses vary from one place to another, the factory probably wouldn't be allowed to continue to operate. Typically, regulations require the removal of the factory if it is ever destroyed or closes for an extended period of time. The site of the factory probably wouldn't be allowed to expand or change into another non-conforming use. Parking a car in your family too. Accessory buildings and uses. Zoning ordinances sometimes allow accessory buildings and accessory uses on a piece of property. Accessory buildings are buildings separate from the main building on a property that supports are regulated in the main building. A detached garage and a pool house are example. Accessory uses are uses that are regulated to build a little different from the principal use of the property. A separate apartment for a family member in a district zone for a single family house. An example of accessory uses. Accessory uses can be in a principal structure or in an accessory building. Many from one. Subdivisions. A subdivision is one piece of land that has been divided into two or more, sometimes many more pieces of land. These individual pieces of property often are called lots or parcels. The purpose of subdividing is to allow for the sale of each smaller individual piece of land. Most subdivisions are created from building houses, but commercial and industrial properties also may be subdivided. Most levels of government that have control over land use adapt subdivision regulations or land development ordinances. These regulations are different from zoning ordinances or master plans, but may be adapted or periodically revised as long as these two documents you may want to find out in your state who adopts and enforces subdivision regulations. I'll give you some important information about particular aspects of subdivisions. It may be on exam. Knowing the main players in plans and subdivisions. Subdividers create subdivisions, and as you thought this would be hard, subdividers generally never get their hands dirty. Most of their work deals with lawyers, engineers, surveyors, sometimes developers. After a subdivision is approved, subdividers can sell the entire subdivision to a developer or builder. A subdivider can also sell individual lots with the promise of eventually putting in roads, sewers, and water lines. A developer usually will develop the subdivision, making physical improvements to it and putting in roads, utility lines, and other infrastructure elements. A developer sometimes builds houses for sale and sells individual lots to builders or to people who want to build a house. A developer sometimes buys and approves subdivisions from a subdivider or can act as a subdivider too. As you see, there can be some overlap in these definitions, but it's good to understand the different people who will be involved in the subdivision process, taking it from raw land to finished houses. The specific legal requirement of a subdivision varies from place to place, but a typical subdivision proposal is based on a plat map. A plat map. That's not a misspelling. Plat maps shows how the entire property is to be subdivided and broken down into individual lots by showing the precise boundaries of each lot. The areas that is being subdivided are often broken down into blocks and lots or sections of lots. For example, an entire subdivision may be divided into 5 blocks, with each block being divided into 10 lots. The total subdivision would be 50 lots. Generally, subdivision regulates and creates and enforces at the local municipal level, but some places have additional regulations at the state level. Sometimes that you need to check out your state is whether it is specific laws dealing with the subdivision, that what's the requirements of the laws are, and especially that what lot counts and laws takes effect. Some states, for example, may require that an offering plan with details about the subdivision be filled with the state government before any lot is sold. The requirement may be in effect only for a subdivision of more than a certain number of lots. This type of state requires is addition to any local subdivision rules and regulations. Following the rules, subdivision and zoning laws. A subdivision must adhere to local zoning laws. Zoning is explained in the You're in the Zone Understanding Zoning Ordinances section early in this chapter. Here are examples of how zoning regulates to subdivisions. You have a 50-acre piece of property that you want to subdivide. The local zoning code says that the minimum lot size for each new house is 1 acre. Knowing that 10% of the land typically is used for roads, and in this case 5 acres, you're probably able to design a lot to take most advantage of the land and can divide the remaining property into 45 lots. That's exactly what you'll do in a straightforward, simple subdivision. To allow for more flexibility in design, subdivisions, some municipalities have adapted density zoning and cluster zoning ordinances. Density zoning ordinances permit the same overall density within the subdivision, which means the same total number of lots on the same overall size property are allowed by the zoning ordinance. The size of an individual lot, however, may be smaller or larger than the minimum required size, and An example I gave you, you still have 45 lots out of the whole 50 acre subdivision, but each lot can be bigger or smaller than 1 acre, as long as the average lot size in that one zoning in 1 acre in the density zoning ordinance permits flexibility of design. A lot of layouts and road layouts. It may also save money by reducing road length and utilities, water and sewer line costs. Clustering zoning goes one step further than density zoning. It clusters a group of lots together in a relatively small area to preserve a certain portion of the property as open space. You may, for example, be able to cluster or group a lot of subdivisions into a total of only 10 acres. That leaves 35 acres without any buildings. Once again, you won't be allowed to create more than 45 lots, but in addition to preserving open space, clustering zones also make for shorter roads and water and sewer lines, which in turn results in saving to the developer. In some places, clustering zones, also known as conservation zoning, crossing state lines for real estate purposes. In this section, the subject of the interstate land sales becomes part of the discussion. However, strictly speaking, it isn't regulations about how land is developed, but rather how it is marketed. And when a subdivision, the land sales are discussed. And yet, it's important enough that the state test writers want you to know something about it. Land in one state has been offered for sale to people in another state, probably for as long as people and land have been together in this country. Unfortunately, buying land straight unseen is risky, although many perfectly honest dealers do business in what is called interstate land sales. Unfortunately, many people have been victims of fraud in these types of deals. The Interstate Land Sales Full Disclosure Act was enabled in 1968 to minimize fraud and dishonest dealings in the interstate land sales market. The act is administered by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, HUD. The requirements of the act applies to interstate sales of vacant or undeveloped lots in subdivisions of 25 lots or more. The act doesn't apply if the lots are 20 acres or larger. However, the act requires developers to file information with HUD describing details of the project, including not limited to the utilities, recreation facilities, locations of nearby facilities, soil and condition. Building a house out of paper. Regulations for construction. You thought it took bricks and wood and nails and cement to build a house, right? It does, of course, but it also takes a lot of paper. Building construction, residential houses and apartments, and non-residential, pretty much everything else alike, is regulated in most parts of the country. The regulations are in place to provide a safe and in recent years more energy efficient construction. The building code is a regulation that provides minimum standards relating to construction, electrical, plumbing, and safety materials, and practices the energy efficient items such as installation. Building codes are adapted and administered at a local level, villages, towns, cities, and countries levels. In some states, the state's government adapts a building code that then requires each local government to use the code or one that is stricter. You need to find out whether your state has a state-wide code and how it applies to the local municipalities. In states that have an arrangement where the local government can adapt a stricter building code, this issue is a favorite question on the exam. The building code also provides details that govern the construction process and that's where all the paperwork comes in. Getting that house built. Although the process may vary from one place to another, you're typically following these steps to build a house. Step 1. Draft plans. Plans are detailed drawings of the building that usually are prepared and completed by the licensed architect or professional engineer that you hire. and it usually includes specifications about specs that provide written details of certain features. Step 2. Filing application. You submit the plans along with the application to the proper government agency, typically the building commissioner or inspector or code enforcement. Step 3. Review the plans. The building department official reviews the plans to make sure that they comply with all of the ordinances and regulations of the municipality. Steps 4. Issue a building permit. The building department then issues you a building permit. You now can officially begin construction. Step 5. Conduct inspections. An official from the building department inspects your project at various points during construction. Some typical items that are inspected include foundation, framing installation, and electrical and plumbing work. Step 6. Undergo final inspection. A building official inspects the project when construction is complete. Step 7. Issue a certificate of occupancy. When the building department is satisfied that you've completed all the projects in accordance with the plan and all the appropriate codes and regulations, it issues you a certificate of occupancy, often referred as the CFO, which is important proof that you properly completed the project. When construction involves internal modifications of a house rather than all new construction, a certificate of completion or compliance may be issued in some municipalities. Step 8. Third party. Although not an official part of the process, I can tell you that after having gone through it a couple of times in my life, you definitely deserve a party. Now, a few words on construction regulations from your state. Most states have regulations concerning development. Some states have more than others. In preparing for the exam, you'll be going to have to hunt around a bit in your home state to find out about the state's development regulations. Finding what state agencies play a part in controlling development and what major laws are and what issues both deal with probably is enough. However, if you have to take a pre-licensing course, pay special attention to the state's agencies and laws they deal with. If you don't have to take a course, in addition to reading this book, just study the material that states give you to prepare for the exam. Possible development issues that your state may deal with include the following. State roads. Find out who controls whether you get permission to put a new driveway off the state road. Usually it will be your state department of transportation or highways. Fire and electrical concerns. Your state may have a special agency or department that deals with regulations for electrical and fire safety issues. Environmental issues. Some states have adopted regulations that require consideration of environmental issues in the development of land. Although adopted by the states, they may be administered at a local municipal level. Historical preservation. Preserving area history is another factor where states have adopted regulations but delegate authority to administer them or adapt more stringent ones to the local municipalities. The government has its say. Other public limitations on property use. Government plays a major role in how land is used. I actually need to say governments because public limitations on land use exist at all levels of government. Village, towns, and cities usually refer to the municipalities, and counties, states, and federal. Government regulations on land use can and do limit what you can do on your property. However, other government limitations on real estate have to do with what you expect the government to do for you in terms of servicing and building. You expect the government to build roads, bridges, parks, schools, and many other infrastructure facilities. The government needs money and land to accomplish these things, so it places limitations on land use that includes its right to obtain the land and the money that it needs to do these things. Most local governments depend on property taxes to pay for their services like schools and road maintenances. Because land doesn't go anywhere, it's always there, it's hard to hide, and unlike salaries, its value is fairly predictable from year to year. It provides a good, stable source of income for local governments. In this section, I talk about general concepts of public limitations on how you can use your real estate, with the exception of federal rules and regulations. All other specific limitations of how they are applied and enforced vary by state and even by municipalities. Fortunately, most of these exam questions ask about the topics that are about general stuff. I point out some of the things that you need to check out in your particular state that you may be on exam. The city wants to build a library. Eminent domain. Eminent domain is the right of government it can exercise to obtain ownership of your real estate against your will. Because you get too upset, I need to clarify that the government always has the right, like any corporation or individual, to negotiate with you to buy your property. Conversely, you are free to turn down the government offer the way you would in any sale of your real estate. In most cases, the governments prefer negotiating when it needs land for something as opposed to exercising its right of eminent domain. The government uses its right of eminent domain when it must have the land, and you refuse to sell it voluntarily. It does this through a suit of condemnation. This process, sometimes called taking, because the government has the right to take ownership of your property through eminent domain. It also has the right to take less than full ownership or less than the entire property. So the government can take the front 10 feet of your land to widen the highway, but leave you the rest of your property. Or it can take the right to install a sewer line underneath your backyard without actually obtaining the land itself. This type of limitation right is called an easement, which I talk about in easing into easements early in this chapter. It can be either an easement in gross or an easement in a Puritan. The government must meet these three requirements to be able to obtain a property through eminent domain. The ultimate use of the land must be for a legitimate public purpose. A fair price must be paid to the owner. The price usually is determined by an appraisal, and sometimes is challenged by the property owner obtaining his own appraisal. The government must follow all required legal procedures, or in other words, exercise due process. The specific requirements of due process vary from state to state, but may also include certain mandatory notices to property owners, minimum times frames of owners to be notified, environmental review before the eminent domain action can be taken. People always can fight eminent domain proceedings in court, either because they believe that the use of the land is a not legitimate public purpose, or because they believe due process was not followed. In addition, they can argue about the value of the property and the related types of arguments with the government. They also can pursue inverse condemnation. Inverse condemnation is where the landowner sues the government because of a loss of value that would result of the government actions. Building a sewer treatment plant can reduce the value of a nearby property. For example, neighboring property owners may sue the government for payment of their property value loss, or to enforce the government to buy their property outright. You didn't know the government was part of your family? Escheats. Escheats, which literally means transfer, is the process by which the state obtains property from people who die without heir and without a will. The legal term for dying without a will is intestate. The state's right preserves property from being without an owner. In case you're wondering, obtaining property by escheat isn't a significant way for the state to get the property it needs for various public use, and it has very little to do with your future real estate career. The term, however, almost always is included in a list of government limitations on a real estate use, and more important, often appears in real estate exams. Pay or lose. Taxation. Taxation of real estate is such an important subject that it has its own chapter, chapter 16. Why is it mentioned here is because most discussions of government limitations on the use of real estate taxation is included. After all, it's the way most local governments, towns, villages, counties, and cities raise money to provide public services and buildings. And if you don't pay your taxes, you lose your property through a process called foreclosure, the most limiting kind of restriction someone can put on your property. Thank you very much. That was part 3. It's All Minds, Owning and Transferring Real Estate. Chapter 8, Knowing the Limitations on Real Estate Ownership.